Hope y'all are all well this evening. We are a little bit behind on our schedule, but that's all right. We can make that up as we go along. If you would take your Bible and turn to the book of Leviticus. This is where we had left off last week, as best I recall. And just a few reminders, few things to by way of overview. Leviticus is not the Hebrew name of the book. The Hebrew name of the book has to do with God's statements, God's speaking to Moses and Aaron. It's translated as Wayirkra, and it means, and he called. But the book that we know as Leviticus takes its title from the translation in the Septuagint, and that name has to do with the priests, the law of the priest, basically. And this book has traditionally been nicknamed the priest's handbook. And that's what it concerns, is the functioning and the activities of the priests, the Levites, in the nation of Israel. The key word in the book of Leviticus is the word holiness, or some cognate of it. It appears about 87 times, and that's the theme of the book. The book is all about how Israel is to become and be and keep themselves holy. It's interesting that about 40 times, almost 40 times in the book of Leviticus, we have statements that God spoke, God said, God told Aaron or Moses or both of them. It emphasizes the inspiration of the information here, that it is from God, not a figment of human imagination or creation of human imagination. Leviticus shows God's plan for atonement. It acknowledges that the children of Israel, like all other people, would sin, that they would fall foul of God. And it explains how they were to go about correcting those issues of sin and uncleanness. The key phrase in the book of Leviticus that appears 21 times, I am the Lord your God, emphasizing the relationship between God and his people. They were his possession. He is their God, but they are his possession. As I think we noted last week, this is not an historical record per se, but you might call it a code of conduct. Now, if you delve into the worship of the various Canaanite cults and religions, you'll see some superficial similarities in the sacrifices and so forth between what they did and what the Israelites are commanded to do here. But the information here is far too detailed, far too specific to be a creation of human origin. Also, you get down to chapter 26 and you have what Archer calls a prophetic preview of Hebrew history. Looking forward from that point in time, Moses gives an overview of the events that will take place. And you would think that the children of Israel, knowing that that was a possibility, would be on their guard against those things. But of course, history shows they were not. I did want to point out to you the 5 principles that Gleason Archer points out in the text here. I think these are worth pointing out, worth note. First of all, it is the responsibility of the people of God to keep themselves holy. You have that statement, that admonition from chapter 11 and verse 45. You shall be holy because I am holy. In other words, if you're going to be my people, you're supposed to be like me. Now, there's a practical application for the Christian there. If we are going to be God's people, if we are going to be Christians, we ought to be Christ-like. We have a model, we ought to follow him. But second, the second principle that Archer points out is that there's only one way for the faithful child of God to come before God. In Israel, the details were spelled out. You could only come before God in the specific way that he has appointed for you. One of the things that set the Israelites apart from the various cults and idol worshiping peoples around them is that their various kinds of worship were based on what they wanted, whereas the Israelites were based on what God instructed them to do. Now, they were also sternly commanded again and again and again and again that they were to maintain moral chastity, moral purity. God created sex. God created desire. And he created that desire to be satisfied and to be fully satisfied. It's a good thing. But God created exactly one environment, in exactly one setting in which it is appropriate to express and to satisfy that desire. And that's within the confines of a God-approved marriage. Among the idolatrous people of that time, it was quite common and continued to be down to the time of the first century. We see this historically in the temple of Diana of the Ephesians at Ephesus. It was quite common to incorporate those desires and the expression of those desires into worship of various kinds, and to draw upon them in the form of cultic prostitution to finance religion. And it was not to be tolerated among the children of Israel. They were to maintain their purity, their morality. And not only that, they were to maintain the morality of their marriage relationships, and they were to avoid anything that would tend to corrupt those relationships. A fourth principle that's emphasized in the book of Leviticus is the avoidance of anything that decays, anything that rots. And that's to certainly to be avoided in bringing that to God. You don't bring God sloppy seconds, basically. And that is emphasized again and again. One of the interesting aspects of that, we think in our time, we think of the peculiarities, the ins and outs of Hebrew worship. And the thing that jumps out at us is unleavened bread that we use in the Lord's Supper. We use unleavened bread because that's what they would have been using at the time that Jesus established the Lord's Supper at the Passover. What we often overlook, and what the denominational community, you might say, aggressively overlooks, is that the fruit of the vine that Jesus and his disciples would have been partaking of would also have been unleavened. It would have been fresh, not preserved and not alcoholic, because they were to purge out all leavening influences from their households in the observance of Passover. Therefore, we would not be correct to go out and buy a bottle of Mogan David or something to use for the Lord's Supper, something alcoholic. It's not appropriate, even though most of Christendom, the denominational community, not only uses alcoholic grape juice, but embraces its use for that purpose. It comes from a misunderstanding of the word wine, the unfortunate translation of that word in our English New Testaments, that Greek word oinos, which does not speak specifically of fermented or unfermented. It simply describes the juice of the grape in either condition. You have to draw on the context to understand what would have been appropriate in the context of the Passover, and that would have been fresh grape juice. But this fifth principle that we see is the number 7, repeated in various ways throughout the book of Leviticus. The religious year was dominated by 7s. You have the Sabbath day, or the 7th day. And I think we talked a little bit last week about the fact that Christendom has attached that notion of the Sabbath to Sunday, but there's nothing in the New Testament that does that. That's not the Christian Sabbath, according to the New Testament. In Israel, you had the Sabbath day, and then you had the Sabbath year every seventh year, and a Sabbath of Sabbaths that led to the Jubilee year, or every 50th year, when land ownership was supposed to revert to its original, those properties that had been sold were to revert to their original families, and so on. And then the Passover was held on the 14th of the month of Abib, the evening of the 14th. Then the Feast of Unleavened Bread was celebrated for the next 7 days, and so on. All of these various high holy days and various holy days corresponded to the number 7 in some way. Feast of Tabernacles, even covering 7 days, and then including an 8th day for the culmination of it all. There are in the book of Leviticus a large number of prophetic symbols, prophetic types, shadows, as it were, that foretell and are fulfilled in Jesus and the church. Now, you've got two basic parts to the book of Leviticus. In the textbook, on pages 216, 217, you have an excellent couple of charts or graphics that give us the 7 main feasts of the Hebrews, Passover and Feast of Unleavened Bread, the wave sheaf, that is Pentecost, as it were, the Feast of First Fruits, or the Feast of Weeks, the Feast of Trumpets, and the Day of Atonement, and the Feast of Tabernacles. Those are the main holy days in the Hebrew calendar. And then across the page, you have an excellent chart of the different kinds of blood sacrifices that were offered in Hebrew worship. Now, having said that, if you turn the page, then you have a description, a sidebar of the main religious festivals, or the main holidays of the year, and that would be Passover and Pentecost and the Feast of Tabernacles, or Booths. Those 3 are the main ones because of the focus of them, the emphasis of them. And at the time of Jesus, we find all 3 still being observed, along with a couple that are not mentioned here, that are not so much holy days as they are historical days. In the time of Jesus, we not only find Passover and Pentecost and the Feast of Booths, or the Feast of Tabernacles, we also find mention of the Feast of the Dedication, which is not mentioned here in Leviticus at all. But it takes us back to the intertestamental period, not to the Old Testament, but to the time of the Maccabees, and we'll discuss that as we get farther down in the class, and the rededication of Zerubbabel's temple after it had been defiled by Antiochus Epiphanes. And you also then find reference to the Feast of Purim, which takes us back to the time of Esther in that same intertestamental era. Now, as far as an outline of Leviticus, you have really 3 basic parts. The first 10 chapters deal with how Israel is to approach God, specifically how the priests are to intercede between the people and God. Then from chapter 11 to chapter 25, you have instructions that really boil down to how to maintain your fellowship with God. Now, chapters 26 and 27, you have that prophetic preview, promises and warnings in chapter 26, and then final instructions about keeping vows and paying tithes in chapter 27. But let's go back to the beginning of Leviticus, chapters 1 through 10. Let me set this aside. I guess I need a bigger lectern or something. I have too much stuff here. Go back to the beginning of Leviticus. In chapters 1 through 10, that segment on how to approach God could be subdivided into 2 parts as well. Chapters 1 through 7 concerns the offering of sacrifices. We have instructions about burnt offerings, grain offerings, peace offerings, sin offerings, and trespass offerings. And the distinction between a sin offering and a trespass offering basically is the distinction, and this is oversimplifying it, but it's the distinction between an intentional sin and an unintentional sin in essence. Come into chapter 8, and in chapters 8, 9, and 10, we have instructions for the priesthood, the consecration of Aaron and his sons as the priests of Israel, the beginning in chapter 9 of the service of the tabernacle. Now remember, at the end of Exodus, how far have we come? Israel has come out of slavery in Egypt. They have crossed the Red Sea by the power of God. The waters stood still, the ground was dry, and Pharaoh's army was drowned. And they have come to Mount Sinai. Moses has gone up to the mountain, received the law, come back, dealt with the golden calf, and then given the instructions to Bezalel and to Aholiab for how to create, how to manufacture everything associated with the tabernacle, the tent of meeting, the structure itself, the furniture that would go in it, and the garments, the garb of the priests, and particularly the high priest. So now at the end of Exodus, they have concluded the construction of the tabernacle. They've made the Ark of the Covenant. They've made the laver and the altar of sacrifice and the altar of incense and the candlestick and so forth. They've got all the pieces and parts finished and together. They've made the high priestly garb, and now they've got to start using it. And that's chapter 9. I think we wound up, if I remember, with the sin of Nadab and Abihu in chapter 10 last week. And Nadab and Abihu, of course, sons of Aaron, men who had been consecrated to serve as priests of God, came into the presence of God and offered strange fire. Now, what was strange about their fire? It says they used unauthorized fire before the Lord. Whether they kindled it themselves instead of getting it from the altar of incense, whether they struck a match, used a lighter, what have you, being a little bit facetious, obviously, but the particulars of it are not revealed, only the character of it. And the significance of that gets back to that fundamental principle that we were looking at a minute ago about how Israel approaches God. God is holy. You're supposed to be holy. Only approach God in the way that he has specified. Now, there's irony in our day in that principle. So obvious in the book of Leviticus. So clear. Only approach God in the way that he has specified. And yet modern Christendom wants to be free to approach God however anybody pleases. I ran across a children's picture book intended for use in Bible classes the other day. Someone had donated it to the congregation here, and it was by a prominent lady pastor in the semi-charismatic movement. I guess maybe they just picked it up in a garage sale or something, but it was something along the lines of, you can pray any way you want to, and it's intended for 4 and 5-year-old children. Well, now that sets a precedent, sets a tone to introduce those children to disregard what God's word says. Do what you want to do, not what God says. Well, the book of Leviticus emphasizes you do it God's way. Now, going back to chapters 1 through 7 for just a moment, there's some keys to understanding the sacrifices that lead up to beginning to put the tabernacle and the priesthood into motion, into use. Principles. Number 1, Leviticus uses the word offering. The Hebrew word is korban. We find that over in Mark chapter 7 and verse 11, where Jesus actually takes some of the Pharisees to task for making a donation to the temple in the name of father and mother, and then saying, okay, I have no more responsibility to care for my aging parents. I've made a donation in their name to the temple. Mom, Dad, I love you, but you go bother the priests. Don't bother me to support you. Well, Jesus takes them to task because they're misusing the idea of a sacrifice or an offering. That word means to draw near or to bring a gift into the presence of someone. And that word appears only in the books of Leviticus, Numbers, and 2 times in the book of Isaiah. And then it's translated in, transliterated in Greek in Mark chapter 7 and verse 11, where Jesus is correcting their misuse of that practice. Now, to offer something to God, sacrifices, blood sacrifices, burnt offerings, and so forth, it had to be offered. It wasn't a tax. It wasn't an assessment per se. It was an offering. There's a lesson in that about how we come into the presence of God with our gifts and offerings. We don't take up a collection. We don't make a donation. We bring an offering. We bring a sacrifice, properly speaking. It was to be, if it were an animal sacrifice, a blood sacrifice, it was to be male, without blemish. It was to be a voluntary sacrifice, and there are a lot of New Testament passages that we could draw into this. Hebrews chapter 9, verses 14, 25, 26. It was, if it were a sin offering, it was in lieu of the sinner himself. Remember Isaiah chapter 53, verse 5, and then verses 10 and 11, speaking of Jesus being our sin offering. And it's interesting, in Isaiah 53 and verse 7, it is an offering killed by the sinner. You didn't bring your animal and then have someone else do the dirty work, so to speak. You had to take its life in recognition that it represented your life. And the blood then was to be sprinkled on the person who offered it. Hebrews chapter 10, verses 13 and 22. And Peter also speaks about that in 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse 2. And the typical sacrifices were a sheep or goat. Sometimes bulls were also used in certain circumstances. Or if that could not, if someone couldn't afford that, they might use fowl, doves or turtle doves, pigeons or turtle doves. When it came to the sacrifices of grains, grain offerings and so forth, it was to be meal, that is fine flour, not just raw grain. It was to have been milled and cleaned and made fit for human consumption, made fit so that it was the best that you had, not just what was readily available. No leaven allowed. No leavening allowed, including honey, Leviticus chapter 2 and verse 11. And it was to be part of oblation. There's that word again, korban, an offering. And an interesting thing, you look at Leviticus chapter 2, verse 13, the meal offering was always to be seasoned with salt. Peace offerings, much the same. Kidneys, liver, fat portions were removed and burned, the organs basically. Neither fat nor blood was to be eaten, according to chapter 3. That had been true in the patriarchal era. Go back to Genesis chapter 9 and verse 4. That was true in the Mosaic era here. And go over to Acts chapter 15 and look at the Jerusalem conference, as we call it, in verses 19 and 20. That is true in the Christian era as well, as Paul and Barnabas are exhorted to convey to Gentile Christians that they're not that they are to abstain from things strangled and from blood. Chapter 4 covers sin offerings for unintentional sins. Priests have a responsibility for the whole congregation and for rulers and for any other person. And then there are additional requirements in chapter 5. Information about trespass offerings. In the offering of a trespass offering, this is when you've done someone else wrong, whether intentionally or unintentionally. And the implication seems to be unintentionally. You cheated somebody and didn't necessarily mean to. You restore full value plus 20%. You don't just say, well, I'm sorry, I'll go offer a sacrifice. You have to make it good as well. Now, coming back over to Aaron and his sons, the consecration of the priests, there was the anointment, there was the beginning of the services and the beginning of the activities of the tabernacle. Now, beginning in chapter 11, this second part of the book of Leviticus, we've seen how to approach God, the fundamentals, the basic outline, how Israel was to approach God. Be holy, for I'm holy. You do it the way I tell you to. You're not at liberty to just make it up as you go along or do what suits you. You abstain from corruption, from immorality, and so forth. You need to keep yourself pure. Now, beginning in chapter 11, we see the focus shift to here's how you maintain your relationship with God. Now you've got it. You've got to hold on to it. Kind of like Benjamin Franklin reputedly telling the woman who asked him about what kind of government this country would have, a republic if you can keep it. All right, now you've got fellowship with God. Here's how you keep it. Bear in mind this strong focus on being clean, being pure in the sight of God. Chapter 11 is about the difference between clean and unclean animals. Speak to the people of Israel, verse 2. These are the living things that you may eat among all the animals that are on the earth. Whatever parts the hoof, is cloven-footed, chews the cud, you may eat. But you don't eat the camel. You don't eat the rock badger. You don't eat the hare. You don't eat the pig. That's the one that we're most familiar with. You go on in verses 9 and following. These you may eat of all that are in the waters. Everything that has fins and scales, whether in salt water or fresh water, seas or rivers. Anything in the seas or rivers that does not have fins and scales. It was tough to be a Jew. You couldn't have fried catfish. No scales. By the way, here's something completely unrelated and just a little freebie tidbit. Did you know that catfish can get sunburned? Catfish hide out in dark places in the shadows in the water because they can get sunburned if they stay out in the bright sunshine. You don't eat catfish. Anything that has scales, though, you can have those. Notice what he says in verse 11, in chapter 11. Things that don't meet my standard, basically, God says, you regard these as detestable. You regard these as unclean. Well, that is not a blanket characterization of pigs and catfish and things like that. What is that? That is God's rule for Israel for the purpose of focusing them on following his laws. He's not saying these things are inherently bad, but rather for the Jews, you don't do this because I told you not to. Now we'll get over to the book of Acts, and Peter's going to see the vision of the sheet let down from heaven with all manner of unclean animals, and he's going to hear what instruction? Rise, Peter, kill and eat. Oh, no, Lord, I've never eaten anything unclean. Don't you call unclean what I have cleansed. And then, of course, he goes to the household of Cornelius, and we have Gentiles coming into the church. Peter had to have that enforced to him in a rather pointed way. Further, as the apostles are sent out, whatever's set before you eat. But back here, you have extensive instructions about what's clean, what's permissible, and what's unclean, what's impermissible. Winged insects that go on all fours, you don't eat those. But you can eat grasshoppers, you can eat locusts, things of that sort. Eat these things, touch these things that are unclean, and you become unclean. Now, without going into all of the details here, come down to chapter 11 and notice verse 44. I am the Lord your God. Consecrate yourselves, therefore, and be holy, for I am holy. You shall not defile yourself with any swarming thing that crawls on the ground. Again and again, the focus is on you be holy because I am holy. You need to do this because I have instructed you to. Now, I heard someone in the background. Did someone have a question or a comment just a minute ago? Or was that just an open mic? Okay. Well, come ahead and just quickly, in chapters 12 and 13 on down to 25, you have regulations. What this amounts to is practical application of the principles of the Ten Commandments. Go back to Exodus chapter 20. You have the 10 commandments laid out, the first 4 dealing with man's relationship with God, the last 6, man's relationship to man, and then chapters 21 and 22, the immediate practical application of those commandments. This is a more expanded application of those principles, how to be holy, how to be clean or pure in the sight of God. So, chapter 12, remember that Israel is required to redeem the firstborn. Well, there is purification that is required associated with childbirth. And in chapter 12, you have the particulars of that. Speak to the people of Israel. If a woman conceives and bears a male child, then she shall be unclean 7 days. As at the time of her menstruation, she shall be unclean. On the 8th day, the flesh of his foreskin shall be circumcised. Then she shall continue 33 days in the blood of her purifying, not touch anything holy, nor come into the sanctuary until the days of her purifying are completed. But if she bears a female child, she shall be unclean twice as long. That's the gist of it. And then the instructions concerning sacrifices for the offerings of children. Chapter 13, instructions concerning leprosy. Now, leprosy still exists in the world today. It's commonly described now as Hansen's disease, and it is fairly easily treatable with modern antibiotics. There are, however, still a few leper colonies extant, still existing in the world today. In that ancient day, without the advent of antibiotics, because it is a contagious disease and some varieties of it are highly contagious, leprosy in that day was something that was as feared then as things like AIDS and COVID are today. And so you have extensive instructions in chapter 13 about identifying leprosy, about distinguishing genuine varieties of leprosy from things that look similar to them, about treating it, and about how you deal with people who have contracted it. Those with genuine leprosy were not allowed to mingle with the population generally. We see a number of cases in the New Testament, in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, where Jesus deals with lepers. And even though they were required to segregate themselves from society and historically were treated very cruelly, run out of town, rocks and sticks thrown at them, chased away, dogs sicked on them, as it were, although the Jews did not typically keep dogs because they were unclean animals as well. Nevertheless, whenever Jesus encounters a leper, it's noteworthy that he does not behave in those ways. He is kind. He even is willing to touch, which traditionally would have caused him to be considered unclean. But you think about someone who has been segregated from society because of this dreaded illness, and the very fact that someone is willing to touch you and not recoil and run away from you, that human touch meant a great deal in that situation. In this case, though, we have instructions even for the houses where a leper might have lived, or the garments, the bed clothing, and so forth. It's instruction about dealing with contagion, really, is what it amounts to. Chapter 14 acknowledges the fact, though, that leprosy could be cured. Now, did they have the medical technology to formulate a cure for it? No, they didn't. But exposure to those elements of the natural world that go into creating antibiotics might very well cause someone's leprosy to come to a halt. And that does not also does not rule out the power of God and answer to prayer in that setting as well. So chapter 14 focuses on dealing with leprosy and making offerings for it, for its retreat or its remission, and instructions to cleanse the house of a leper and so forth. After all, the house in the promised land, the property, the estate, would still remain in the family even if the leper could not occupy it. And so it had to be cleansed before someone else in the family could take it and occupy it. Now, continuing on, you have regulations concerning the various bodily emissions in chapter 15, concerning all of the normal aspects of human living. And then in chapter 16, you come to Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. And you have very specific instructions in chapter 16 about the Day of Atonement. Now think about this. This is, in a sense, the high point of the Hebrew year, because functionally speaking, everything starts over at this point. The sacrifices are offered. The high priest goes into the Holy of Holies, the most holy place where the Ark of the Covenant is, twice on that day. First, to offer an offering for himself and his family, so that he can then stand between God and Israel as an intercessor, offering for the nation and putting off the scapegoat to drive away sin for the succeeding year. Further instruction in chapter 17 about sacrifice, prohibitions in chapter 17, 18 about unlawful dietary things. Don't eat blood. The life of the flesh is in the blood. Chapter 17, verse 11 echoes Genesis chapter 9. You don't do this. Blood makes atonement by the life. And then in chapter 18, regulations concerning unlawful relationships, unlawful sexual relationships.
Brother Dave.
Go ahead.
I'm sorry, I apologize for interrupting you there. I was a little bit confused on chapter 16, Yom Kippur. Could you give me a little bit more on that, please? I've heard of it, but I never really explored it very much.
Yom Kippur that's simply the Hebrew expression for the Day of Atonement. Yom, day, Kippur, atonement. Okay. And the instructions in chapter 16 deal with what was to take place on that day each year. That's the day that the high priest would make the sacrifices, first for himself and his family, and then for the nation, that marked the putting off of the guilt of sin collectively for the whole next year. Over in Hebrews, and remember the connection between Leviticus and Hebrews, not so obvious to us because we don't come out of that Jewish background, but screamingly obvious to any Jewish Christian in the first century. In Hebrews, what's one of the points that the writer makes about the ineffectiveness of going back, Hebrew Christians going back to practicing Judaism to escape persecution? In that annual sacrifice, there is an annual remembrance of all of your sins. In other words, they're not fully forgiven by that sacrifice. That sacrifice merely anticipates the offering of Jesus, who once for all removes sin. So here you have the instructions. You offer the bull as a sin offering for yourself, verse 8, for Aaron, the high priest. The two goats, set them before the Lord at the entrance of the tent of meeting, and cast lots over them. One of them shall be for the Lord, one of them for Azazel, or basically is the scapegoat, the one that's driven away, symbolically carrying with it out into the wilderness the guilt of all the sin of the high priest. And then you do the same thing for the nation, for the whole people. Presents the bull as a sin offering for himself, and so forth. through chapter 16, but this is an annual affair. This is how you do it. Notice verse 2, tell Aaron your brother not to come at any time into the holy place, that is what we would call the most holy, or the Holy of Holies, the inner section of the temple structure, tabernacle structure. Do not come at any time before the mercy seat, so that he may not die. I think a lot of Christians, a lot of religious people for that matter, don't realize that even the high priest did not come and go where the Ark of the Covenant was on a regular basis, on a daily basis. The priests in the course of their service came into the holy place, that is, into the outer part where the altar of incense and the lampstand and so forth were, the table of showbread, and they serviced the table and the lampstand and incense, but they didn't go in where the Ark of the Covenant was. They didn't go into the portion of the tabernacle and later the temple that represented God's room, basically, except on the Day of Atonement.
Okay.
And I've read somewhere, and I don't remember now where I read it, that on the Day of Atonement, when the high priest went in there, it became a tradition that they would tie a cord around his ankle, so that in the event that he died before the Lord, he didn't come back, they could pull the body out without themselves having to go in there and lose their lives for going in there, which I found that kind of an interesting little tidbit. But chapter 16 is all the details of the ritual, or the procedure for the Day of Atonement. Notice down here in 16 and verse 20, when he has made an end of atoning for the holy place and the tent of meeting and the altar, he shall present the live goat. Aaron shall lay both his hands on the head of the live goat, confess over it all the iniquities of the people of Israel and all their transgressions, all their sins. He shall put them on the head of the goat and send it away into the wilderness by the hand of a man who is in readiness. The goat shall bear all their iniquities on itself to a remote area, and let the goat go free in the wilderness. It's the Hebrews writer says in that annual routine, there's a constant reminder of all the sins of the past. Whereas in Christ, those things are washed clean, washed away by the blood of the perfect sacrifice.
Thank you.
You're welcome, brother. You're welcome. I apologize. I'm having to go faster really than I would like to, but that's the nature of a survey class, I guess.
I understand.
Anyhow, come over into chapter 18, prohibitions of unlawful sexual relationships. No fornication. Umbrella term, it incorporates every kind of illicit sexual activity. Men and women, men and men, women and women, people and other things, other people and animals and so forth. All of that prohibited. Specifically, you look at verse 22, 23, you shall not lie with a male as with a woman. It is an abomination. And that word abomination is common in the book of Leviticus. It is a detestable thing. One sister years ago from Jamaica, in reference to pride, gave actually a good definition of abomination. She said it makes you stink in the nostrils of God. Well, that's what this idea of abomination, uncleanness is. It's offensive to God. You shall not lie with any animal, make yourself unclean with it. It is perversion. These things are forbidden by God. Now come into chapter 19. Speak to all the congregation of the people of Israel. Say to them, you shall be holy. Why? For I, your God, am holy. You shall revere every one of you, his mother and his father. Keep my Sabbaths. I am the Lord your God. Do not turn to idols. Do not make for yourselves gods of cast metal. I am the Lord your God. Interesting sidebar on that. Traditionally in Israel, art was not an occupation or a practice except in geometric forms and shapes. Hebrews did not traditionally draw or paint pictures or make sculptures of any living thing in order to make sure that they did not run afoul of this instruction not to make graven images or cast images. Interesting little corollary to that, acting, the profession of acting among the Hasidim, the ultra-conservatives, even today is regarded by some as a form of idolatry because you are representing yourself as something that you're not. So, continuing on, here's how you offer a peace offering, a sacrifice of peace offering at verses 5 through 8. And then notice here in chapter 19 at verse 9, from verse 9 down to verse 18, a whole series of instructions about how you deal with each other, how you treat your neighbor. You don't, verse 18, you don't take vengeance or bear a grudge against the sons of your own people, but love your neighbor. How? Over in Matthew chapter 22, a lawyer comes to Jesus and asks him, he's testing him, basically says, Master, which is the most important commandment in the law? Now, you think about this, he's trying to set Jesus up in a sense. If you say this is more important than that, what's the implication? Well, then some commandments of God basically don't count. As long as you do the big things, then the little things can slide. If Jesus answers that way, they've got him basically minimizing the commandments of God. So what does Jesus do? He doesn't answer in the way that they perhaps hoped he would. The first and great commandment is this: thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, soul, mind, and strength. But then he goes on and says, a second like unto it. In other words, a second commandment just as important as that first commandment of the 10 commandments is this. Leviticus 19 and verse 18. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. And then what does he do? Then he brings everything else into play and says, on these two hang all the law, everything in the Torah, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. On these two hang all the law and the prophets. Everything is based on this. What Jesus basically did is said, all right, the 10 commandments cover man's relationship to God and man's relationship to man. That's all there is in our existence. That's the basis of everything else. Well, here's that second and like unto it commandment. Love your neighbor as yourself. Now, further instructions in chapter 19, you honor the aged, stand up before the gray head and honor the face of an old man. Fear your God, I am the Lord. Remember that you were strangers in Egypt. Now, in this, he's coming back to maintaining your relationship with God, coming from you do this, you do this, you do this, to don't you dare do this or this or this. Chapter 20, don't you get involved in child sacrifice. The Canaanites that they were tasked to drive out of the promised land engaged in child sacrifice, Moloch worship, the worship of Chemosh and so forth. And this would continue among these pagan people even after the conquest of the land, because the children of Israel never quite finished the job. They stopped short of where they should have gone. And so they are then exposed to this. In chapter 20, gives the prohibition against it. You don't offer the fruit of your body for the sin of your soul, as the New Testament describes it. We have further instruction about sexual immorality in chapter 20. and then come over into chapters 21 and 22, specific instructions about the priests, holiness, and the priests, who they can marry, who they can't marry, how they behave, how they dress. They're not allowed to make ritual scarification. Many years ago, in teaching through this material, one elderly sister in the congregation, I saw the light go on in her eyes as we passed through this section of Leviticus. And just before the class was over, she pops up and says, back there in chapter 21, what do you think that means about all these sailors have tattoos all over their bodies? And I was just caught off guard. And before I could respond, her husband, in a stage whisper that everybody could hear, just sort of leaned over and casually says, and just exactly what would you know about sailors' bodies? Rescued me from having to deal with it, basically. But chapter 21 is dealing with making a distinction between the servants of God and the priests of the various idol cults and false deities that they were exposed to in that ancient day. And so God's people and God's priests, it's worth pointing out, in Christ, we are all, every Christian is a priest, or if you want to be specific, a priestess of God, just as those ancient priests were to be distinctly different, so are we. And that's chapters 21 and 22 there. Information about acceptable offerings at the end of chapter 22. Back up in 22 for just a moment to verse 14. I want to draw your attention to something here. If anyone eats of a holy thing unintentionally, he shall add the fifth of its value to it and give the holy thing to the priest. Now, in context, that would perhaps be considered, in the course of a sacrifice, we accidentally hold on to a piece of the sacrifice that was intended for the priests. And we realize when we get home, we've offered the sacrifice, the priest missed it, I missed it. Here we are back home again. I can't really go and take it right now because it'll spoil, et cetera, et cetera. This is an unintentional thing. But notice, even then, even when it's unintentional, it has to be made right. And that's significant because so many times in our day, particularly, emphasis is poured onto the intention behind something or the lack of it. And the effort is diligently made to try to excuse sin because, well, it wasn't intentional. I didn't mean to, therefore I shouldn't have to pay the penalty for it. God makes a distinction in the penalty between murder and manslaughter. But just because someone who accidentally kills someone didn't do it on purpose doesn't mean they get off scot-free, as we saw previously. Chapter 23 gives us instruction concerning the various feasts of the Jews, those 7 feasts, the Sabbath and the Passover and first fruits and so forth, and mentions also the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, verses 26 down to 32. It shall be to you a Sabbath of solemn rest. You shall afflict yourselves. And on the 9th day of the month, beginning at evening, from evening to evening, you shall keep your Sabbath. That's the Day of Atonement, though, in that context. Now, chapter 24, instructions concerning various things, the oil for the lampstand, the bread for the table of showbread, the bread for the tabernacle, punishment for things like blasphemy, and then what sometimes is described as lex talionis, the eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, proportional retribution. Notice what verse 17 of chapter 24 says. The general principle, whoever takes a human life shall surely be put to death. And that word surely in our English translations is important because the Hebrew there takes away the option aspect of that. Under the law of Moses, under the Old Covenant, the penalty for murder was death, period. Now we get over into the book of Joshua and Judges, and in the more specific application in the provision of cities of refuge, now God makes provision for the case of accidental homicide. But even there, a penalty has to be paid for the shedding of blood. Because it was accidental and it's adjudicated as accidental, the life of the killer is not forfeited, but he's confined to the city of refuge until the high priest dies. And generally speaking, it's understood that the life of the high priest then answers for his life's blood in that setting. Chapter 25 gives us the Sabbath year, the explanation of the Sabbath year every 7 years, the year of Jubilee, verses 8 down to 22, where the property all reverts back to its original families and so forth. Those who are sold into indentured service go free. Debts are canceled and so forth. Notice verse 23, the land shall not be sold in perpetuity, for the land is mine. You are sojourners, strangers with me, and all the country you possess, you allow for the redemption of the land. God reminds them yet again, you're here by my grace, and this belongs to me, not you. We go on then in chapter 25, you have instructions concerning benevolence. That plays into the book of Ruth later on with Boaz taking care of Ruth and Naomi and redeeming Mahlon's estate so that he can marry Ruth and bring up children not in his own name, but in her previous husband's name. And then chapter 26, as I said, the prophetic preview of history. Blessings for obedience, curses or punishment for disobedience. These would be the things that they would recite at Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim in the promised land. Notice verse 23 in chapter 26. If by this discipline you are not turned to me, this is in the section that deals with punishment for disobedience. If this discipline doesn't correct the problem, you continue to walk contrary to me. Notice what he says in verse 24, I will walk contrary to you and strike you sevenfold for your sins. In the days of Jeremiah and Ezekiel and Daniel, Zechariah and Haggai, when the children of Israel go into Babylonian captivity, Zedekiah and his ilk, those ungodly people that rule the nation, even as they're being oppressed by the Babylonians, are whining and complaining that we don't deserve this, we didn't cause this, it's not fair, our fathers were the ones who were so evil and unfaithful, our ancestors did this, we shouldn't suffer for their sins. And I have no doubt that Jeremiah and Ezekiel must have at times pointed them back to this passage and said, boy, payback is awful, isn't it? Payback is tough. I will strike you sevenfold for your sins. But notice down here at verse 40, as he says, you'll have no power to stand before your enemies. You'll be eaten up and left to rot. But come to verse 40, if they confess their iniquity and the iniquity of their fathers, the treachery that they committed against me and walking contrary to me, verse 42, then I will remember my covenant with Jacob and with Isaac and with Abraham. I will remember the land. The land shall be abandoned by them and enjoy its Sabbaths while it lies desolate without them. And they shall make amends for their iniquity. Yet for all that, I will not spurn them, and I will restore them. Now, chapter 27, the end of Leviticus, gives us instructions about vows, about how vows are to be made and repaid and fulfilled, and how that a father has basically veto power over the vow of a wife or a daughter. He can allow it to stand or he can nullify it, things of that sort. The gist or the focal point in chapter 27 really is very simple. If you make a vow to the Lord, if you make a vow in the presence of the Lord, you better keep it, because he will not just let it go. Now, take that principle, bring it over into the 21st century world, and where is this more ignored, excused, overlooked than in marriage in our world today? We have prominent folks in our society who mock the idea of marriage and say, well, that we don't need a marriage license. We don't need to be married. It's just a piece of paper. It doesn't mean anything. And that might be true in the sense that, yes, that's just a piece of paper. And if it burns up in a house fire or something, you're not unmarried because of that. But it represents a vow. And you don't make a vow in the presence of God lightly, because he will hold you to it. Now come over into the book of Numbers, and let's get, unless you have comments or questions, in the book of Numbers now, we have what we could call proof of God's providence. That's the book of Numbers. And I'm going to have to shuffle some stuff around again for just a second here. Proof of God's providence. You look at the book of Numbers, and the first thing you encounter is a census, a counting of all of the men of military age, basically there at Mount Sinai, as they're getting ready to go toward the promised land. And you get to the end of the book of Numbers, and you have what? Another census. So many men from this tribe, so many men from this tribe, so many men from this tribe, so many men. They start out with 603,550, and then you get to the other end of the book of Numbers, and you've got 601,000 and a few. What happens in between? What happens between Numbers 1 and the end of the book of Numbers could be described as a 39.5-year funeral procession. Because those 603,550 soldiers, men of military age, and their wives, age 20 and up, and any unattached folks that were either too old or were among the tribe of Levi that were not counted in these censuses, in that 39.5 years, they died. If we take just the men of military age 20 and up, in that 39.5, almost 40 years, you allow a little bit of time for the leaving from Egypt to Mount Sinai and Sinai on to Kadesh Barnea and so forth. If we take just the men, they averaged probably 1,000 funerals a day for 40 years. A 40-year funeral procession. You look at all of the counting and the exemption of the Levites and so forth here, the arranged details of how the camp is arranged, these tribes over here, these tribes over here, these tribes in front, these tribes behind. And it's very tempting to look at this as just a book of nothing but details, just dry, dusty history, dry, dusty details. Numbers is anything but dry, dusty history. This book in the Hebrew is called In the Wilderness. And it's not a day-by-day record of that 40 years, but an overview of the events of that 40 years in the wilderness. It's called Numbers in English because the translators of the Septuagint, the Jews who produced the Septuagint translation in Greek, called it that about 200 years before Jesus was born. And that title, that description, clearly refers to the counting of the soldiers, the censuses that take place at the beginning and the end. But this is the record of the wilderness wanderings, indisputably penned by Moses. It emphasizes that God's people can only move forward with his blessings. They can only go so far without God. Now, it covers 2 generations of Israelites. This is the death of the slave generation, 40 years funeral procession, and this is the maturing of what could arguably be called Israel's greatest generation, as we use that term. Tom Brokaw coined that description of the World War II era, Depression and World War II era generation in our history, the greatest generation. This could arguably be applied to the upcoming generation in the book of Numbers. An alternative description of the events in the wilderness might be to describe this as 40 years of, Moses, are we there yet? Because they carp and complain and attack Moses and gripe and grumble again and again and again and again. You would think after a while they'd learn, but they don't seem to. So the reason for their drawn out, protracted wandering and journey, keep in mind, we've got 600,000 soldiers. We've got at least that many women. If we want to be just really conservative and say 603,000 soldiers, 603,000 wives, and 1 child per couple, we've still got almost 2 million people. Plus all of their herds and flocks and animals and so forth. Now they're wandering, they're moving, they're living a nomadic existence, so they can't very well settle in somewhere and really breed out large numbers of animals. And they're not depending on their herds and flocks for food because God is feeding them in the wilderness, manna and quail and so forth. So we don't have just massively enormous flocks and herds of animals, but still, if we want to say one animal of some sort, be it a sheep or a goat or a donkey or an ox, one animal, herd animal of some sort per family, you still got nearly 2 million people on the extremely conservative side, plus over 500,000 animals that have to be fed and watered and tended to and taken care of everywhere they go. Why would they spend 40 years out in the wilderness? Well, you get down to chapters 13 and 14, and here's why. 10 faithless men. Who are the 2 faithful spies? Of the 12 surveyors, shall we say, the 12 spies that Moses sends into the land at Kadesh Barnea, who are the 2 faithful ones?
Caleb and Joshua.
Caleb and Joshua. Now name the 10 faithless ones.
Nobody knows them.
Their names are in the text. They are here. And their names actually are the meanings of their names are interesting in their own right. because they should have lived up to the meanings of their names, but they didn't. You get to chapter 13, you've got Shammua, whose name means renowned, and Shaphat, he, that is, God has judged. Caleb, one of our faithful guys, you know what his name means? Dog. Caleb the dog. Not a very flattering name, actually. You get over here, and now you've got Egal, he redeems. Hosea, salvation. Joshua, that is. Palti, my deliverance. Gadiel or Gadiel, God is my fortune. You've got Gadi, my fortune. And then you've got Amiel, God is my kinsman or my relation. Sether, which means hidden, or also has some other meanings there. Nabi, which also can be translated as concealed or hidden. And Guel, which means the majesty of God. These men, some of these men had names that should have emphasized their faithfulness, and instead they become faithless in their role as spies for Israel. Now, the book of Numbers actually tells us very little about the nation's day-to-day existence. You go to Deuteronomy chapter 29, and in verse 5, Moses says their clothes didn't wear out, their shoes didn't wear out. We see in the book of Numbers, God feeds them consistently for that whole generation of 40 years. And even then, what do? They gripe and grumble. What is this stuff? We want meat. And they find fault. You brought us out into the wilderness to die of thirst, Moses. Complain, complain, complain. What's happening during that time? We're disposing of a generation who don't trust God, who carp and complain and find fault, and raising up a generation who will take God at his word and trust him. Their utter dependence on him for daily survival. As the faithless generation passes away, the faithful generation, what will become the greatest generation, is learning this lesson of dependence on God. His manna never fails. Their clothes don't wear out. That impresses on them their need for his loving kindness, for his goodness, his generosity. They were being schooled, even though they didn't always learn the lessons very well. They're being schooled to accept and to honor the priesthood and the sacrifices and the worship and the order or the law that God had established for them. So by the time 40 years are up and the funeral procession comes to its end and they're ready to go into the promised land, they've become very familiar, in a sense, with God, in a good sense, and they've learned to appreciate the lessons that God teaches very, very forcefully, you might say, in the wilderness. Now, it's 7:15, so let's take about a 15-minute break here. Before we do, are there comments? Are there questions before we break? And then we'll come back and look through Numbers and Deuteronomy, and we'll almost be caught up again.
I have one.
Okay, go ahead.
Whining was a skill set for the Israelites. It was a total skill set. Their gratitude was short-lived, and their short-term memory was awful. They'd get bailed out of a scrape and then right back in.
Yep. It's almost, you almost get the flavor at times that they're looking for trouble to get into before they're even out of the trouble that God's getting them out of again. It's almost as if with one eye they're watching God and being thankful that he's delivering them, and with the other eye they're looking for mischief to get into.
Exactly.
And I like the way you put that. Whining was the number one thing in their skill set. Other thoughts, other comments?
Brother Dave, one last, back in Leviticus, one word kept coming up, and that was the word corn, or ears of corn. I've always thought that word corn was not maize as we know it, but that was referring to the grains the cereal grains that they referred to. That is not maize or corn like we know.
That is correct. In fact, that is a holdover from Old English. In the translating of the King James Version and the Geneva's Bible, and the Geneva Bible, the Great Bible, Matthew's Bible before that, Tyndale and so forth. In Middle English, corn, in English common law, you have the corn laws. That word does not refer to what we recognize, maize on the ear, that kind of specific grain or vegetable, really.
Okay.
But rather it is, in Middle English, it's a generic term for grain. It would encompass, it certainly would include what we call corn, shucked off the cob and dried and ground into cornmeal, but it would encompass wheat and barley and rye and spelt and all kinds of other edible grains. It's a generic term in that context.
Okay, very good, very good.
And actually, if you pick up certainly an English Standard, probably, I haven't checked it, probably a New King James or a New American Standard, and just compare, you'll find some of the newer translations will use the word grain rather than corn.
Okay, gotcha. Thank you.
Hey, you're welcome, brother. Let's go ahead and take our break now, and we'll reconvene at about 7:32 and tear through the book of Numbers a little more. A topical summary in 4 points. I'll give you a 4-point topical summary and then a brief 4-point outline, and then we'll talk about some specifics in the book of Numbers. A topical summary would be chapter 1 through the first 10 verses of chapter 10, preparation. And then from chapter 10 through chapter 14, perversity prompts profound persecution, persistent perversity.
Did you mute that thing again?
You can get it off the recording. Numbers 15 through 19, provision and purification. And then chapter 20 through chapter 36, basically the second half of the book almost, preservation and precautions. I don't remember where I picked up that topical outline. All I can tell you is that it's not original to me. I have never been that alliterative in my life. That may be Robert Taylor Jr., come to think of it. Now, a brief outline of the book, a 4-part outline, corresponding to those same breaks. Chapters 1 through the first part of chapter 10 is Israel at Sinai. This is the children of Israel at Mount Sinai, and this covers a period of 19 days. So chapters 1 through the first part of chapter 10 cover 19 days, from the 1st to the 20th of the 2nd month after the Exodus. And you've got 5 things that are covered there. The numbering and the arranging of the people in chapters 1 through 4, the cleansing and the blessing of the congregation, chapters 5 and 6, the offerings of the princes of the various tribes and the dedication of the altar in chapters 7 and 8, the second Passover being observed in chapter 9, and then the beginning of the march, the cloud by day, the pillar of fire by night, and the sounding of the trumpets for the march for them to actually leave in the rest of chapter 9 into chapter 10. So that's the first part, Israel at Sinai, 19 days there. Chapter 10 through chapter 14. The rest of chapter 10 through chapter 14 is from Sinai to Kadesh, and that's only 10 days. Took them 10 days to get from Mount Sinai to Kadesh Barnea, on the south side in the Negev, on the south side of what would become Judah's territory. Didn't take long at all. That's the 2nd month after they come out of captivity. and it tells about the departure from Sinai and the events at Taberah and Kibroth Hattaavah in chapter 11. It tells us about the rebellion of Miriam and Aaron in chapter 12. And then it tells us about the mission of the spies in chapters 13 and 14. So that covers 10 days. It didn't take long. They sent the spies ahead. They looked, came back, great land. And of course, the 10 said, there's no way we can do it. And they weren't looking at God in that. Chapters 15 through 19, third part, wanderings in the desert. This is the in the wilderness part of the book, and it covers a total of about 38 years, from the end of the second year to the beginning of the 40th year. And it records the different laws that are mentioned there, the punishment of a Sabbath breaker in chapter 15. It covers the rebellion of Korah in chapter 16, Korah and the princes of Israel, the budding of Aaron's rod in chapter 17, talks about the duties and the revenue that accrues to the priests and the Levites in chapter 18. And then it talks about the water of separation, or a test for those who are unclean, in chapter 19. Now, that's the bulk of the time. But then from chapter 20 to the end of the book, you have from Kadesh to Moab. You know, in this 38 years, they basically make a big circle through the wilderness and wind up back where they start. Now, it's not a perfectly round circle, obviously, but they wind up back at Kadesh, and now they have to go from Kadesh to Moab, around from the south over to the east side. And that's a period of about 10 months at the beginning of the 40th year. And this gives us the story of Balaam, the prophet who could not curse Israel, and the zeal of Phinehas in helping put away uncleanness among the people. It gives us the second census in chapter 26, instructions for how to divide up the promised land, the appointment of Joshua as Moses' successor, instructions about offerings and vows. It gives us the war with Midian in chapter 31, and the settlement of Reuben and Gad and half of the half tribe of Manasseh. They want to stay over there in the plains of Midian. It gives us a list of all the places that they camped in chapter 33, and then instructions: clear out the land of Canaan, clear it of its inhabitants. Now, chapter 35 is important because it gives us the cities of refuge to be appointed, and the realization of that instruction constitutes one of the signs that God has fulfilled his promise to give them the land. We'll get over into the book of Joshua, and that's where those cities are actually appointed, and that is one of the signs of fulfillment. And then in chapter 36, you have instructions concerning the marrying off of heiresses, those daughters who inherited their father's possession in the promised land. So come back to the beginning. Chapters 1 through 4, you have the first census, 603,550 soldiers. The majority of them, the largest number of them, not the majority, but the largest single block of them, from the tribe of Judah, if memory serves me correctly. And then preparations for travel, how to arrange the camp. The tabernacle is in the center of everything. God's presence is at the geographic center of everything. On the north side of the camp, you have Dan and Asher and Naphtali. On the east side of the camp, you have Judah, Issachar, and Zebulun. On the west side of the camp, you have Ephraim, Manasseh, and Benjamin. And on the south side, Reuben, Gad, and Simeon, or Reuben, Simeon, and Gad. When they march, when they move from place to place, the tabernacle and the Levites stay in the middle of the column, in the middle of everything. But when they move, it's Judah, Issachar, and Zebulun. The east side leads the way, and then the south side, and then the west side, and then the north side tribes, in that order: east, south, west, north, in order, with the Levites and the tabernacle in between, in the middle, between the north, or between the south and the west side tribes. So chapter 3 gives us then the duties of Aaron and his sons, and the basic duties of the Levites in verses 5 through 39 are threefold. The Levites, number one, they guard the tabernacle, the tent of meeting, and all the people. You look at chapter 3 in verses 7 and 8, it says here, they shall keep guard over him, that is, over Aaron the priest, and over the whole congregation before the tent of meeting as they minister at the tabernacle. They shall guard all the furnishings and keep guard over the people as they minister. That's their job, is to keep Israel safe, basically, in the presence of God. Then, verse 10, Aaron and his sons are to guard their priesthood. They're to guard their position, their responsibility. If any outsider comes near, he shall be put to death. On pain of death, they are to guard the priesthood. And then verses 11, 12, and 13, the role of the tribe of Levi among the people. They're God's property. They're God's possession in place of all of the firstborn of all the other tribes. They become his personal property, you might say, in lieu of a sacrifice of all of the firstborn. Now, later on, in chapters 45 through 51, we have the redemption of the Levites. You have a total of 22,273 Levite men in the census. They're not warriors. They don't go to battle. They serve before the Lord. And 22,000 of these Levite men are exchanged, basically, for the firstborn in all of Israel at that point in time. You have 273 others, 22,273 firstborn, 22,000 Levites. The 273 who exceed the number of Levites are redeemed by the payment of 5 shekels of silver each, paid to Aaron and his sons, verse 48. So Levi is the redemption for the firstborn in Israel. Chapter 4 gives us the number, the eligible Levites for service. You've got a total of 22,000. Among the Kohathites, you've got 2,750 who can serve in the tabernacle. That's ages 30 to 50, verse 3 says. Ages 30 to 50. This is the age of service in the tabernacle. So you've got 2,750 of the Kohathites, and then 2,630 of the Gershonites, and their duties are explained there in verses 21 through 28. And then you've got 3,200 of the sons of Merari, the Merarites, and their duties are laid out in verse 44. So you have a total of 8,580 men out of all of the 22,000 Levite men, 8,580 who serve the tabernacle in some way. What do the others do? Well, they're either too young or they're too old. They occupy the roles of teachers, instructors. They are the leavening influence among their kinfolk, among the other tribes. Chapters 5, 6, and 7, we have the purifying of the people in chapter 5, and then instructions concerning vows and offerings for the tabernacle in chapters 6 and 7. Now, there are 2 parts to the instructions that are given in chapter 5 about purifying the people. And the first 4 verses, chapter 5, verses 1 through 4, deals with matters of physical impurity. Command the people of Israel that they put out of the camp everyone who's leprous or has a discharge, and everyone who is unclean through contact with the dead. 3 basic classes: lepers, and those who have some kind of a running sore or a bodily discharge, and those who've been temporarily defiled by contact with those who are dead. And that would be an ongoing issue while they're in the wilderness, because like we said, it's a 40-year funeral procession, basically. Leviticus chapters 13 and 15 give instructions for purification from leprosy and discharges, and 21 deals with dealing with corpses and so forth, and dead animals would be included in that as well. Purification is to be made according to the instructions back in Numbers, down in Numbers chapter 19 and verse 12. That's to do with physical impurity. But there's another aspect to this, and verse 5 down to verse 31, down to the end of the chapter, that's spiritual impurity, the problem of sin, atoning for sins among the people. And there are two sections here as well. A general statement in verses 5 through 10 about correcting sins. How do you correct sin? What do you do about sin? In a nutshell, you realize it, you recognize it, and you confess it, verse 7, and you pay for it. You make restitution for it, verses 8, 9, and 10. So you have to recognize it, you have to acknowledge it, you confess it, and you make restitution. Now, this instruction is not meant to cover a defiant, intentional sin. What's in view here is an unintentional sin, a slip, not open rebellion against God. Verses 11 through the rest of the chapter give us a specific example. Here's what you do, for instance, in this situation. Well, a test for adultery or infidelity, real or imagined. You know, it's entirely possible. The accusation is husband against wife, and it's entirely possible it's all in his head, that it's irrational jealousy on his part. Maybe she's exceptionally beautiful and he can't take his eyes off her, so he's just convinced that no other man can, and that somebody better looking than him is going to arrest her attention. So he's irrationally unsure of her. Maybe she is a strumpet and unfaithful to him. Either way, here are the practical instructions for ascertaining that. A test is given to determine purity. Now, there are some preliminaries. If there's actual adultery, but no witnesses to it, then the penalty is death. Leviticus chapter 20. If it is imagined, if it's suspected but can't be proven, obsessive jealousy might be the cause of that. Then there, verses 14 and 15 speak to that. And then Numbers chapter 5 and verse 15, an offering is required in either case. But then you have this test to determine purity. Now, the details there, water is mingled with dust from the tabernacle. The woman's hair is loosened. She holds the offering. An oath and a curse are administered. She is to say, Amen. May it be so. And then the purity test, the thing is administered in verses 23 to 28. It's sealed through that bitter water, and it's to be drunk by the accused woman, consumed. The results are observed. The results of the test are observed. The outcome is determined, verses 27 and 28, whether it's true or false. And there are two things to note here. If it proves false, that she's not guilty, her husband is penalized for accusing her. And it's interesting to note that there is no record in the scripture of this ordeal, as it's described, ever actually being administered to anyone. That doesn't mean that it wasn't, but we don't have any inspired record of it taking place. And verses 29 and 30 emphasize you don't get to shortcut this process. The accused woman bears her consequences if she is guilty. If she's guilty, he's free from iniquity. He's not charged for accusing her. But if she's innocent, it's the other way around, and he's penalized. Now, chapter 6 brings us to the Nazarite vow. And I want to spend just a couple of minutes on this because there is a lot of misunderstanding of this in the religious community generally and among some of our brethren. You'll find occasionally someone who refers to Jesus as a Nazarite, and he never was, as far as we know. There's no record of him ever taking a Nazarite vow. But that word Nazarite simply means consecrated or separated, and it describes the condition of the person who freely takes upon him or herself, a woman could be a Nazarite as well, a special vow. Look at verse 1. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to the people of Israel, say to them, when either a man or a woman makes a special vow, the vow of a Nazarite, a consecrated person, to separate himself to the Lord, he shall separate himself from wine and strong drink. So you've got a whole list of requirements for this special vow. Not all vows the Jews took were Nazarite vows. And the fact that a Nazarite vow, that a vow was a Nazarite vow, that had nothing to do with the substance of the vow itself. It wasn't one particular vow. It was a set of qualifications added to a vow. A Nazarite vow didn't affect what the particular vow was about. It affected the conduct of the person who made the vow. The requirements: no wine, no strong drink, verse 3. Neither vinegar or grape juice or grapes or raisins were permitted under a Nazarite vow either. And that makes it very similar to the vow of the descendants of Rechab over in Jeremiah chapter 35. Normally, a Nazarite vow was a limited time vow. It had a starting point and an ending point, verse 4. There's no specific time frame given. It could be a comparatively short, it could be comparatively long. Samson was supposed to be a Nazarite from birth to death. But there's added emphasis here on abstaining from any produce of the grapevine. Verse 5, no haircuts, no shaving, no death defilements, even for family members, verses 6, 7, and 8. If they were accidentally defiled through contact with a dead body, then there was a whole procedure to become purified once again. The head was shaved on the 7th day after the defilement. An offering was made on the 8th day, and then on that 8th day, they were reconsecrated, which basically means the vow starts all over again. And a male lamb was offered, and the previous time of consecration, that was voided. The whole thing starts over again. You don't just pick up where you left off. And then the vow had to be fulfilled. Offerings were given at the temple: a 1-year-old male lamb for a burnt offering, a 1-year-old ewe lamb, a female lamb, for a sin offering, a ram for a peace offering, a basket of unleavened bread, plus grain and drink offerings. And the priest is to do all of the offering of these different things. The hair then of the person with the vow is shaved and it's burned in the fire of the peace offering, verse 18. And then a wave offering is made afterwards, signifying the fulfillment, the end of the vow. This was not a vow to be taken lightly, because it was an expensive vow with all of the things that were required. Any additional vows that were made in connection with or made at the same time as the Nazarite vow were also to be fulfilled at that time, verse 21. So fulfilling the Nazarite part of the vow didn't release you from any other vows that you had made. Now you come to verse 22, and from verse 22 to verse 27, you have the Aaronic or the priestly, that's Aaron, not ironic, but Aaronic, or the priestly blessing for the people of Israel. And this is familiar to a lot of us as the words of the lyrics of a hymn in our hymnals. In the hymnal Praise for the Lord, it's number 631. The Lord bless you and keep you and make his face to shine upon you and give you peace. A very familiar song that we sing. Chapter 7, the offerings to consecrate the tabernacle. And there are a lot of similarities between chapter 7, what's done here and what's brought and offered. A lot of similarities too, and a lot of differences from, in terms of volume. the consecration of Solomon's temple over in 1 Kings chapter 6 and 2 Chronicles chapter 7. Solomon followed the pattern that was established here, but not point for point. A lot of similarities, a lot of differences. You have the gifts given to the Levites by the other tribes in verses 1 through 11. And this basically is stuff for the Levites to use in the service of the tabernacle, in the service of the tent of meeting, oxen and carts and so forth, wagons to carry everything. It's a portable temple, basically. Each tribe contributes one ox and half of a wagon, basically, half share of a wagon. Two wagons and 2 yoke of oxen, 4 animals are given to the Gershonites because they carry the actual tent, the structure, the curtains, all the folding things. You've got 4 wagons and 4 yoke of oxen given to the Merarites, and their job is to carry all the framework, all the wooden stuff, all the hardware, the poles and the bars and things like that. The Kohathites don't get any oxen, they don't get any wagons, because they carry the furniture. They carry the Ark of the Covenant, the altar of incense, the lampstand, the laver, the altar of sacrifice, and so forth. Those are carried personally by them, according to verse 9. Now, you start at verse 12 here in chapter 7, and 12 days of offerings by each tribe, 1 day per tribe, or 1 tribe per day, I guess, bringing offerings to the tribe of Levi for their work as the priestly tribe. And you have a summary of what they gave in chapter 7, verses 84 through 88. This is a long chapter, and exactly the same offerings are given by each tribe, except for Levi, obviously, because they're the ones receiving all of this. There is no one-upmanship in these offerings. Every tribe gives exactly the same things. The order in which they're presented is the same as the order of march for when the camp moves. The tribes that led the way, and then the ones that were right in front of the ark, and then the ones that were right behind the tabernacle, and then the ones that brought up the rear, in that order. They brought a silver plate, 130 shekels weight in silver. They brought a silver bowl, 70 shekels weight, both of them filled with fine flour with oil as a meal offering. A golden spoon or dish, 10 shekels weight, filled with incense. A bull, a ram, a yearling lamb as burnt offerings. A billy goat, a male goat as a sin offering. 2 oxen, 5 rams, 5 billy goats, 5 males, 5 yearling lambs as peace offerings. Each tribe brought all of this. Now come down to verse 89 in chapter 7. When Moses went into the tent of meeting to speak with the Lord, he heard the voice speaking to him from above the mercy seat that was on the ark of the testimony, from between the 2 cherubim, and it spoke to him. Presumably, what God said is the text of chapter 8, because the next verse, chapter 8, verse 1, the Lord spoke to Moses saying, here's what you tell Aaron to do. So chapters 8, 9, and 10 have to do with purifying the Levites, how to keep the Passover. This is going to be the first Passover after they've come out of Egypt, and a summary of the wilderness travels, the beginning of their actual journey. Now, the purifying of the Levites, that's chapter 8. Before they could fulfill their duties for Israel, they had to be purified. And there are 2 basic sections. First, they have to be purified physically, washed, and spiritually. That's verses 5 through 13. And then they have to be separated or set apart for their role, their specific job as the priestly tribe. And that's verses 14 through 22. You have details of their washing and their purification. Moses is to be the one who sprinkles them with water of purifying. up to this point, Aaron is the designated priest, but his priestly duties are only just beginning. Moses has been the go-between between Israel and God. So it's Moses that fulfills this role at this point. And he is the one who presents them both before the Lord's presence at the tent of meeting and in the presence of all the other tribes. He is the go-between for the Levites between God and their brethren. And that prepares them then to serve in their role. At the end of chapter 8, you have instructions for what happens when they age out of service. This applies to the Levites from 25 years old and up. They shall come to do duty in the service of the tent of meeting. From age 50, they shall withdraw from the duty of the service and serve no more. They minister to their brothers in the tent of meeting by keeping guard, but they shall do no service. Thus shall you assign to the Levites to do assigning their duties. Now, chapter 9 gives us the Passover. This is the first Passover since captivity. The first time was in Exodus chapter 12, while they're still in Egypt. This would be the second time. The 14th day of the first month, in the evening, according to all the ordinances of it, in other words, exactly as you were instructed a year ago, this is verses 1 through 5. And notice verse 5. They kept the Passover in the first month, on the 14th day of the month, at twilight, in the wilderness of Sinai, according to all that the Lord commanded Moses, so the people of Israel did. They did exactly as they were commanded. But verse 6, we got a problem. Some of them could not keep the Passover because they'd been burying people that had died. They'd handled dead bodies, so they're unclean. What do we do? Can't just ignore the problem. Can't pass it off. Oh, well, too bad. What do we do, Moses? Moses goes to God for guidance. Now, here's a precedent. Here's an example. Joshua should have been paying attention to this, and he didn't, apparently, because over in Joshua chapter 9, he's going to make a treaty with the Gibeonites that's going to come back to bite him because he did not consult God first. Moses consults God for instructions on what to do, and God's response is they're allowed to defer their Passover observance until the second month, provided they do everything else exactly as it should have been done the first time. This was not a matter of option. It was not you can do it first month or the second month. It was if you're unclean the first month, then you can do it the second month. It was not a matter of preference. It was not for someone who was inconvenienced the first month. Notice down here at verse 14, you have the possibility that a stranger who travels with the Israelites, and this would be Moses' kinfolks, the Midianites, for example, in chapter 10, verses 29 through 32, they might want to observe the Passover also, and they're allowed to. You have some rules for them, and their rules are identical to the Israelites. Now, chapter 9, verse 15, down to verse 23 is a thumbnail sketch. This last paragraph of chapter 9 is a thumbnail sketch of all the travels in the rest of Numbers. On the day that the tabernacle was set up, the cloud covered the tabernacle, the tent of the testimony. At evening, it was over the tabernacle like the appearance of fire until morning. So it was always. The cloud covered it by day and the appearance of fire by night. Whenever the cloud lifted, after that the people of Israel set out, the people of Israel set out. In the place where it settled down, there the people camped. And so this is how it worked for the rest of the time. They followed the pillar of cloud. Now, in chapter 10, in verses 1 through 10, you have instructions for the trumpets that are used as signal devices. Now, these are not instruments of music for entertainment or instruments of music for worship or anything of the sort. These are for instruction. They're communication devices, basically. 2 silver trumpets of hammered work. These are not shofarim. These are not ram's horn trumpets. These are metal trumpets. Use them for summoning the congregation, for breaking camp, and so forth. They serve the purpose of a cavalry bugle. They communicate depending on what signal is blown. The people from all around can hear and know what to do, what's going on. Given that there's no traffic noise and so forth, they could be heard all over the camp for miles around, no doubt, because it would have been a quiet place, basically. Now, these are used to direct the people in their march, in their movement. Chapter 10 gives us the beginning of the journey, the beginning of the wilderness wandering, basically. They leave Mount Sinai. They're headed to the promised land. Think about this for a minute. But for the faithlessness, the unbelief of the slave generation who had grown up being exposed to idolatry in Egypt, but for their faithlessness, they could have gone into the promised land right then. The fulfillment of the promise was delayed by 40 years because they were faithless. They never got to see the promised land because they didn't trust God. But now they leave Mount Sinai the second year, second month, 20th day of the month, and they set out by stages from the wilderness of Sinai and moved piece by piece on toward Kadesh Barnea. The people complain in chapter 11, and God is angry, and they're punished. Notice in chapter 11 also, God directs Moses to appoint elders. Gather for me 70 men of the elders of Israel, whom you know to be elders of the people, officers over them. Bring them to the tent of meeting and let them take their stand with you. And I will come down and talk with you there and take some of the spirit that is on you and put it on them. And they shall bear the burden of the people with you, so that you may not bear it yourself alone. Moses, appoint judges, basically. This would be rules recommendation as time goes by. But these men are to take some of the burden from Moses in leadership. This is not necessarily going to turn out well ultimately, because chapter 16 will be introduced to Korah and 250 princes of Israel who think they ought to be running things. This is, however, the basis for the number who serve on the council in the New Testament in the first century. The Sanhedrin, as we call it, traditionally numbers 70 members. Scholars argue back and forth about whether that includes the high priest or if he is a 71st member, a tiebreaker, basically, sort of like the vice president in the Senate. But regardless, that is, this passage seems to be the basis for that number in later years. Now, chapter 12, Miriam and Aaron oppose Moses. And in one way, this might be understandable to us. They're both older than Moses. And in that culture, baby brothers bossing them around, as it were, they spoke against Moses. Well, what's the real issue? They don't like the woman that he married. Now, this is interesting because she's described here as a Cushite woman. He had married a Cushite woman. Cush is the area traditionally understood as Ethiopia, which would be an African woman. Is this someone other than Zipporah, the Midianite daughter of Reuel or Jethro? Jewish commentators and scholars are divided about this. Some will go back to this, and the Cushite woman, that word Cush is interpreted as not being a geographic description, but a slap or a slander, as it were, against Zipporah. Others say, no, he had more than one wife. And this was the issue, regardless. Now, notice, Moses is never condemned or scolded specifically for having more than one wife. And he's never stated as having, these are the wives of Moses in the scriptures. But notice the issue. Aaron and Miriam, for whatever reason, they don't approve. And look at their methodology. They're going to discredit Moses. Has the Lord spoken only through Moses? Has he not spoken through us also? Now, it's true that God had spoken to Aaron. What about Miriam? If he has spoken to her at all, it's been very, very minimally, and certainly not in a leadership capacity. The Lord heard their complaint. It doesn't say that they're out among the camp publicizing this and moaning and groaning publicly. It may have been just the two of them comparing notes, but the Lord heard it. And by inspiration, then at verse 3, Moses recorded something that would be astonishing, except that it's not him bragging on himself, it's the Holy Spirit inspiring to write this. The man Moses was very meek above all the people that were on the face of the earth. Now, meekness is a quality commended in the New Testament, but we need to understand that meekness, he's not a milquetoast. He's not a shy, retiring weakling. He's a man who is very, very much in control of himself. That's what meekness means. Power under control. Moses has control of himself. And we've seen that again and again in his dealings with his own people. And we will see it throughout this time in the wilderness. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron and Miriam, you come out to the tent of meeting. And he's going to justify Moses against them. Miriam becomes leprous, like white as snow. And so everything comes to a screeching halt right here, and Moses pleads for her. Big sister. Put her outside the camp 7 days, we'll isolate her, and then she can come back in. And now we're ready to go. Camped in the wilderness of Paran. So, chapters 13 and 14, the spies, 12 spies, one from each tribe, sent into the land of promise. It's a good land. At the end of 40 days now, they're camped there, they're waiting. 40 days, they come back and they report. It's a good land. It's everything God said it was. And the 10 spies, there's no way we can do this. And Joshua and Caleb, let's go get it. God promised it. He's on our side. Joshua and Caleb press for faith. And that parallels Paul's statement in Philippians chapter 4 and verse 13, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. At this point, God is fed up. Moses, I'll tell you what, I'll make you a deal. I'm just going to wipe these people out, and I will use you and your descendants to fulfill my promise. And Moses intercedes for the people. How much of a temptation might it have been for a lesser man to say, oh, I can be the progenitor of the Savior? Not Moses. That goes back to that previous statement, meek above all the people on the face of the earth. So they've griped, they've complained, they've got Aaron and Miriam acting up. You've got the faithlessness of the spies. And now God says, I'm going to judge the people. I've pardoned them according to your word, chapter 14, verse 20. but I'm going to judge them. All this generation will die out in the wilderness, but Caleb has a different spirit. He shall possess his inheritance. And then Joshua, the son of Nun. None shall come into the land, but Caleb and Joshua, verse 30, of that generation. Come over to verse 38 in chapter 14. Again, this is reiterated. Joshua and Caleb, only those two. So, the word gets out. The Lord has turned us away. Oh, now we're ready to go in. No, don't do it. God is not among you. God is not on your side at this point. But they presumed, verse 44. They presumed to go up. You know, it's an all or nothing deal. Oh, well, if that's the case, we're ready to go. No, not now. You've blown it. So they presumed to go up, and they were defeated. The Amalekites, the Canaanites, the people of the hill country defeated them and chased them away down to Hormah. Chased them away from Kadesh Barnea. God has cemented Moses' position as Israel's leader. He has vindicated him against Aaron and Miriam. He has provided Israel an opportunity to trust him, and they have failed the test. And now victory requires genuine faith, not just going through the motions. 15, 16, and 17, you have laws about sacrifices and about unintentional sins in chapter 15. If you sin unintentionally and do not observe all these commandments that the Lord has spoken, then if it was done unintentionally, verse 24, without the knowledge of the congregation, then you offer this sacrifice and we'll take care of it. If an individual person, verse 27, sins unintentionally, see, that previous is corporately the whole nation. Now individually, you offer the sacrifice and the priest makes atonement and it's reconciled. In the meantime, now we've got somebody breaking the Sabbath, and he's taken outside the camp and stoned because he violated the Sabbath. He violated the commandment of God. In chapter 16, we have Korah fomenting a rebellion against Moses. Look at verse 3 and the accusation here. Moses and Aaron, you have gone too far. You take too much upon yourselves. All the congregation are holy, every one of them. The Lord is among them. Basically, they're saying, why are you anybody special? And so Moses takes it to God, falls on his face, and says to Korah, all right, we'll meet and let God sort this out. I'm not the one to do this. God will sort this out. And the outcome of it is that the earth swallows them up, and Moses and Aaron are vindicated before the people. Chapter 17, Aaron's staff buds. Two main subjects here. The accusation by these rebels and God's vindication of Moses and Aaron. Come over into chapters 18 and following now, and here we're getting down. I'm getting ahead of myself here. Forgive me. I'm getting ahead of my own notes here. 18, 19, and 20, you have the inheritance provided for the Levites here, the duties of the priests, what their responsibility is, how they're to be redeemed. God is continuing to provide for the needs of his people, even as they're getting near now the end of the wilderness wanderings. There are many funerals all through this time. At this point, the prospect of entering into the promised land, the majority of the time has passed, and now they're beginning to focus on receiving the promise, going into the land. There's a changing of the guard taking place, so to speak. And this must have been on everybody's minds, and the priests and the Levites are perhaps wondering at this point, how are we going to survive if there's not territory for us. And so you have instruction here concerning how they'll be taken care of, and the rest of the tribes are to provide for their needs. Chapter 18 gives the details of their material support. Chapter 19 is a pressing issue as the generation is passing away, how they have to be purified and deal with all of this. And then chapter 20 sets the stage for changing the guard as they're about to enter into the land of promise. Notice in chapter 20, they're gathered at the rock of Rephidim. Again, this complaint, no water. You brought us out here to die of thirst. And God says, you speak to the rock. Previously, strike the rock and it gave water. Now, speak to the rock. And Moses, verse 11, Moses lifted up his hand and struck the rock with his rod, with his staff twice. Water came out abundantly. But what did he do? He challenged them. He chastised the people, verse 10. Hear now, you rebels, shall we bring water for you out of this rock? Is the issue that he took credit in verse 10? Or is the issue that he struck the rock when God told him to speak to it in verse 11? Well, you get down to verse 12, and practically speaking, it makes no difference. The Lord said to Moses and to Aaron, because you did not, notice this, because you did not believe in me to uphold me as holy in the eyes of the people, therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land that I have given them. These are the waters of Meribah. Now, later on, Moses is going to plead with God about this. Please let me go into the promised land. And God is going to repeat this statement. You didn't believe me, but in the very next verse, he's going to say, you didn't obey me. Belief encompasses obedience. Well, that's what James tells us in James chapter 2, isn't it? Faith and works. Show me your faith apart from your works, and by my works, I'll show you my faith. At the end of chapter 20, we have, chapter 20 begins with the death of Miriam, by the way. And at the end of chapter 20, we have the death of Aaron. And Eleazar, his son, takes his place. Chapters 21 to 24, you have conflicts in the wilderness. This is a conflict with Balak and the issue with Balaam, the false prophet. You have the brazen serpent, the brass serpent, there from verses 1 to 9, where the people have complained and God sends poisonous serpents among them, and they have to look at the serpent to live on the pole. But then moving forward, we have Moab and Midian, the defeat of Sihon and Og. You've got Sihon, the king of the Amorites, and the request is made in verse 21, 22, let us pass through your territory. We'll not turn aside. We won't despoil it. We'll pay for everything we use. And he wouldn't have any of it. And he stands between them and the promised land. These people, Sihon and Og, the territory belongs to the Ammonites and the Midianites, Moabites rather, descendants of Abraham's nephew, Lot, through his incestuous relationship with his daughters. They're kinfolks to the Israelites. Moses' wife, Zipporah, was a Midianite woman. Her father was a priest of God, Jethro, or Reuel, as we know him. However, about the same time that God was bringing Israel out of Egypt 40 years ago, 39 and a half years ago, a people called the Amorites invade this area of the Moabites and the Ammonites, the eastern side of the Jordan River, the plains on the east side, and they conquer. They assimilate the Ammonites and the Moabites. So now we have Sihon and Og, kings of the Amorites. these invaders. Sihon lives at Heshbon, which is in the south, down close to the Dead Sea on the east side. Og lives in the land of Bashan, which is farther north, the plains of Moab. Sihon is associated with the city of Heshbon. Og is simply associated with the plains of Bashan, not with any particular city. These people stand in the way of Israel, and they are unwilling to allow Israel to pass peaceably through their midst. Now, this is interesting because of the territory involved. This is the territory that will become the inheritance of Reuben and Gad and part of the tribe of Manasseh. But these were people that Israel would have peaceably passed through rather than conquering and taking their territory had they agreed. This was territory that was not actually part of the land of promise in the original deal. But because these people put up a fight, the Israelites defeat them. And Reuben and Gad and part of the half tribe of Manasseh come to Moses later on and say, can we have this territory? This is what we'd like, this borderland of the land of promise. That's going to create some interesting dynamics among the tribes in its own right, and we'll get to that later. I see that it's 8:29, so we've got a minute to get down to the end of Deuteronomy. I apologize for not moving as rapidly as I need to. Chapter 22, you have the issue with Balaam and his talking donkey, the angel of the Lord turning the donkey aside. You would think that if your donkey turns around and talks to you, you'd recognize that something is up about this. And apparently all he was focused on is the promised reward that Balak offered. Balaam is not able to curse Israel. 3 times he tries, 3 times he blesses them. And in order to get his reward, he says, I can't do what the Lord won't let me do, but I'll tell you what you can do. You can corrupt their morals, and that will cause God to turn aside from them. Well, that's exactly what they do. You have Baal worship taking place at Peor in chapter 25. And here is where Phinehas, or Pinchas, as it would be pronounced now, Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, the son of the high priest, literally pins an adultering pair, a fornicating pair to the ground, and stops the plague that God has sent because of this ungodliness. Chapter 26, you have the census of the new generation here, 601,000 of the Israelites. And then in chapter 27, a question about heiresses, the daughters of Zelophehad, what to do there. And Joshua is appointed to succeed Moses. The rest of Numbers concerns daily offerings, sacrifices, feasts, and offerings for the various high holy days, the issue, the request of Reuben and Gad for that territory on the east side. Notice the warning in chapter 32, verse 23, to those tribes: if you engage in sin, if you turn aside to the idolatry of the land, be sure your sin will find you out. Your sin will expose you. The boundaries of the land are laid out in chapter 34. 33 is a record of their travels. The boundaries of the land are laid out in chapter 34. Cities of the Levites are specified in chapter 35. And then chapter 36 concerns the daughters of Zelophehad, the marriage of female heirs, of heiresses, because the men of Manasseh want to make sure that they don't marry off into other tribes, and then that territory is lost in the year of Jubilee to those other tribes. That brings us in a nutshell to the end of Numbers, and we'll look at Deuteronomy and play catch up next week. Comments, questions, thoughts?